In 1999, two games were released in the series, both 3D games and both for the Nintendo 64, both taking place after Nocturne in the Moonlight. The first was called Devil's Castle Dracula Apocalypse, and the second was Devil's Castle Dracula Apocalypse Supplementary Story, The Legend of Cornell. Phew, what a mouthful. Anyway, the first one lets you choose between two characters, both attempting to destroy Dracula. You could play as Reinhard Schneider, who, like John Morris, is not a Belmondo, but is related to them, and he uses a whip. Or you could be Carrie Fernandez, a descendant of Saifa Fernandez. Interestingly, upon localization, her name was kept the same and not changed to Belnades. Legend of Cornell takes place a few years earlier, and you play as Cornell, a werewolf whose sister Ada was kidnapped by cultists, wishing to resurrect Dracula. They're both good games, but Devil's Castle Dracula Apocalypse was rushed out, with many of the features they wanted to add cut, and later re-added in The Legend of Cornell, leading that game's release to incite a lot of anger, as they felt that they bought a stripped-down version, and then were asked only months later to buy the full version at full price. Legend of Cornell had 3 other characters to unlock, including Reinhard and Carrie, and a new character named Henry Oldry, who had to rescue several children hidden throughout the levels. Upon localization, Devil's Castle Dracula Apocalypse was simply titled CastleVania. Due to the fact that it has the same name as the NES game, and because it's on the Nintendo 64, a lot of people like to call it CastleVania 64. The second game, Devil's Castle Dracula Apocalypse Supplementary Story, The Legend of Cornell, goddamn, was renamed CastleVania Legacy of Darkness. In 2001, Konami released yet another remake of Devil's Castle Dracula, only this time it was a remake of a remake. Retooling the X68000 version for the Sony PlayStation, Konami released Devil's Castle Chronicles Devil's Castle Dracula. What is with these damn titles? Anyway, it was basically the X68000 version with updated graphics, a remix soundtrack, and less punishing difficulty. The game also lets you play the original X68000 version, which is pretty cool. It was released in America, simply titled CastleVania Chronicles, and although I very much prefer that title, it always pissed me off when I first heard about the game. I assumed it would be some sort of collection, not just one game. Oh well. Also in 2001, Konami released Devil's Castle Dracula Circle of the Moon for the Game Boy Advance. Much like the N64 games, it's considered to be a side story to the series, essentially taking place after Nocturne in the Moonlight, but before Legend of Cornell. The game stars Nathan Graves, a vampire hunter attempting to rescue his mentor, Morris Baldwin, and destroy Dracula and his consort Carmilla, making her first appearance since appearing as a boss in Dracula 2: The Accursed Seal. The gameplay was fairly similar to Nocturne in the Moonlight, using that same Metroid style, though being much more limited in terms of items and weapons, making Nathan rely instead on a magic system used by collectible cards. The game was well received and one of the most popular Game Boy Advance launch titles. For the localization, the game was called CastleVania Circle of the Moon in America, and in Europe it is simply called CastleVania. In 2002, another Game Boy Advance Metroidvania-style game was released, CastleVania Concerto of the Midnight Sun, the first title in the series to be named Castlevania in the original Japanese. The game takes place after Dracula 2: The Accursed Seal, and stars Shimon Belmondo's grandson, Juste Belmondo. The game plays similar to Nocturne in the Moonlight and Circle of the Moon, though with several references to Dracula 2, including Juste having to collect the pieces of Dracula and battle his ghost. An alternate mode allowed you to play as Juste's friend Maxim Kish, similar to playing as Richter in Nocturne in the Moonlight. Upon localization, the game was released in America as CastleVania Harmony of Dissonance. Interestingly, at this point, I'd like to point out the musical nature of the names. So far we've had Nocturne, Symphony, Concerto, and Harmony. In 2003, Konami released another 2 games. The first was the third and final release for the Game Boy Advance, CastleVania Minuet of Dawn, another musical title. Taking place in the year 2035, the game stars Soma Cruz, an exchange student living in Japan, who along with his girlfriend Mina is sucked through a portal at a temple during an eclipse and winds up at Castlevania. The backstory states that Julius Belmondo destroyed Dracula for good in the year 1999 and sealed the castle away in an eclipse. Now there is no Lord of Darkness, and several people are being attracted to the castle due to the power vacuum left by Dracula. The game introduced a new cast of characters, including Yoko Fernandez, a descendant of Sypha, and Alucard, who took the Japanese name Genya Arikado. Julius Belmondo himself, Hammer, a weaponsmith, and Graham, a priest who believes himself to be Dracula. Minuet of Dawn, of course, is known for its twist ending, and I'm not going to say what it is, because I'm planning a playthrough, so I don't want to spoil it for anybody who's looking forward to that. In a lot of ways, Minuet of Dawn is an ending to the series. It's one of the best received games in the series, and is my personal favorite. There was also an extra mode where you could play as Julius Belmondo. For the American release, it was renamed Castlevania Aria of Sorrow, yet another musical name. Konami also released it as a double pack on a cartridge that also included Harmony of Dissonance. As Minuet of Dawn is somewhat of an end to the story, Konami released another game in 2003, this one being a beginning. As Devil's Castle Dracula Dark Knight Prelude had been stricken from continuity, the series now lacked an origin. It had also been a while since Konami attempted to bring the series into the third dimension. Both of these were handled with the release of Castlevania for the PlayStation 2. It was the last in the series to be called Castlevania in Japan, and it did not have a subtitle as it was the beginning of the story. The game involves 2 men, Baron Leon Belmondo and Matthias Kronqvist, a warrior and strategist respectively. Matthias's wife was killed by a vampire lord named Walter, and when Leon's fiancée is taken, he leaves his title and duty behind to rescue her. In the end, Sarah, Leon's fiancée, sacrifices herself, and her soul is infused with the whip Leon had been using, creating the vampire killer whip. Leon destroys Walter, but Matthias betrays him and steals the vampire's power, becoming the Lord of Darkness, who would eventually take the name Dracula. For a 3D entry in the series, the game was received very well, and it plays somewhat like Devil May Cry by Capcom. In America, the game was called Castlevania Lament of Innocence, and in Europe, it's simply Castlevania, making it the third game by that title to be released there. Though I suppose that has nothing on Japan's many, many games called Devil's Castle Dracula. In 2005, 2 more games were released, and like in 2004, one was a handheld Metroid-style game, and the other was a home console 3D game. The handheld game was Devil's Castle Dracula Crucifix of the Blue Moon for the DS. It's a sequel to Minuet of Dawn, taking place a year later. In it, cultists are attempting to bring forth a new Lord of Darkness, and Soma Cruz must stop them. The game was very similar to its predecessor, with minor tweaks, including use of the DS's touchscreen abilities. Like in Minuet of Dawn, Crucifix of the Blue Moon also features a secondary mode where you can play as Julius Belmondo. And in a tribute to the legend of the Devil's Castle, you can switch to Yoko Fernandez, who plays like Sypha, and Alucard, although he plays more like he did in Nocturne in the Moonlight. In America, Crucifix of the Blue Moon was renamed Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow, which tied it to Aria of Sorrow and also gave it the DS initials that were popular with early DS games. The other game was a sequel to The Legend of the Devil's Castle, entitled Devil's Castle Dracula Curse of Darkness for the PlayStation 2 and Xbox. It was the first and so far only game in the series to be released on more than one system simultaneously. Devil's Castle Dracula: Curse of Darkness allows you to play as Hector, a former minion of Dracula who retired to a life of peace, but returns against his former master once Dracula curses the land to darkness. You could also play as Ralph C. Belmondo after finishing the game once. The game was well received, though it tends not to get much attention as CastleVania on the PlayStation 2. In America, the game was localized as CastleVania Curse of Darkness. Curse of Darkness and Circle of the Moon, I believe, are the only two to retain the same subtitle in both America and Japan.